Hello and welcome. Carbon footprints, global warming, pollution levels are all buzzwords in today's discussion on the state of the environment. Stories of the destruction of Earth create an eager audience, and movies like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth break box office records as headlines scream rising sea levels with images of mammoth icebergs breaking apart. On July the 7th, the Live Earth concerts took place in 8 cities around the world, reaching 2 billion people with the aim of raising environmental awareness. It was organized as part of a multi-year campaign led by the Alliance for Climate Protection and other international groups to drive individuals, corporations and governments to act against global warming. There are a few voices of dissent on this issue, but some are willing to speak up, no matter how unpopular their opinion might be, and that includes my guest today. What are your thoughts? We'll take your questions and comments at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. But joining me to challenge the widely held belief that the environment is getting worse is environmentalist Bjorn Lomborg, who was named one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine after the publication of his controversial book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. His new book is out in September. It's entitled Cool It, and further explains Bjorn Lomborg's arguments against being environmental alarmists. Bjorn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ruth.
I have to start off by asking you now, let's get your perspective on this. Is it that there's no major problem with global warming, or is it that there are problems and we just have to approach them differently?
Well, it's definitely that there is a problem. Global warming is real, and I think we should also thank Al Gore for having put this forward. I mean, Al Gore in a way has made global warming cool again. But, and of course there is a but here, he has also focused incredibly on all the worst case scenarios and very often exaggerated them, as have many others. And exaggerating these threats, only telling one-side stories, means that we're not likely to make very good judgments on these.
When you say exaggerated, you know, most of these debates and things are always backed by scientific evidence that stretches out, you know, papers and papers, reams of papers. So, you know, when you say exaggerated, surely these scientists have some foundation for why they believe the figures are the way they are.
Well, let me give you just 2 examples. One is when we talk, for instance, about climate change. You think about it's going to get hotter, we're going to see more heat waves, and that's absolutely true. And so a lot of people focus on these heat waves. For instance, in Britain, it's estimated that you're going to see another 2,000 more people dying from heat every year. Now that's an important message to put out there, and that's certainly something we've heard. But of course, when temperatures rise, we are going to see fewer cold deaths as well. And since cold deaths virtually everywhere on the planet outweigh heat deaths, we're actually likely to see about 20,000 fewer cold deaths. Now, mentioning the 2,000 heat deaths, but forgetting to mention the 20,000 fewer cold deaths is not a good way to instantiate our discussion on climate change. The other example is, because that's sort of leaving out an inconvenient part of the argument. The other part is when you exaggerate just outright. For instance, when you talk about sea level rise. Yes, sea level is going to rise. The UN Climate Panel, which is the gold standard that we all argue from, which really does incorporate all these thousands of studies, they talk about a foot or 30 centimeters of sea level rise. But Al Gore and many others will happily go out and talk about, well, maybe we're going to see 6 meters or 20 feet of sea level rise. And I understand why, because it looks better on the screen when you show these stories, but it's just not helpful in making a considered discussion about what should we do.
We'll get more of your perspective in a second as we get to a call, and we've got Travis on the line from Kansas. Travis, what would you like to ask?
I would like to do more. I watched the Earth Day concerts, and I'm very concerned about the climate change and what I can personally do. What aggravates me, I guess, the most would be that I would like to do more, but there's not much that I can do outside of changing my light bulbs. Okay. I believe in climate change. I would like to do more.
Let's get some advice then from Bjorn on that. And this is what you say, actually, isn't it? That well, what can we do as individuals?
Yeah, and the answer, honestly, is very little right now. I perfectly understand the sentiment. We want to do something about this problem. But the real fact, if you look, for instance, the BBC had one of its reporters, ethical man. He, for a year, had to live with his family as ethically as he possibly could, as low carbon as he possibly could. They sold their car. They didn't go traveling. It was excruciating. I mean, he looked into how he could get cremated ecologically. So he went to a very large and long stretch. Yet all he managed to do was to cut his emissions by 20%. And so obviously the problem here is we can't do very much as individuals. This is about a long haul effort. This is about investing in research and development so that we get much better technologies. This is about investing in wind and solar, but also in carbon capture and in energy conservation, maybe fusion, maybe fission. There are lots of different things.
How do you feel about the whole wave there seems to be for hybrid cars, the move towards better power? Maybe the awareness is good if nothing else.
I think it's great that people care, and I think we should applaud the fact that people really want to help make a better planet. There are two things, though, that we have to remember. Global warming is not the only problem in the world. There are many other problems out there. As the Live Earth pointed out, there's global warming, but as the many other Earth concerts that we've seen before, there are also problems with communicable diseases, with malnutrition, with lack of clean drinking water. The list goes on. And of course, one of the things I've tried to point out, together with some of the world's top economists, is to look at how much can you actually do, how much bang for your buck can you get if you invest in different areas. And the honest truth is, if you invest, for instance, in preventing HIV/AIDS or malaria, for every dollar you spend, you end up doing somewhere between $20 and $40 of social good. But if you invest that dollar in climate change, you easily end up only doing 30 cents worth of good. So I want also to make sure that it becomes cool to think about the right things, to think about the things where we can actually make the most effort first.
But of course that can make you very unpopular in terms of, you're against the wave of the way people are going. And are you happy with being unpopular? I mean, you've even had pies thrown in your face.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be unpopular, but I think it's very, very important that we try to stay true to the real aim that I think both Al Gore and everyone else has, namely that we want to leave this a better planet than we found it. We actually want to make sure that our descendants get the best deal that we can possibly give them. If we focus too much on trying to make what is really just symbolic acts right now, changing our light bulbs, great, but it's not going to matter all that much. But forget all the misery that's right there and now, which is HIV/AIDS, malnutrition, malaria, lack of free trade, all these things. Then we're not doing the best that we can. And secondly, we need to fix climate change in the long run, but let's be realistic. If we try to cut, which everybody seems to say that they want to do right now, we'll end up with large political promises, but they're not going to get fulfilled. What we should do is much more focus on investing in research and development so that we will be able to make it happen in 25 or 50 years.
What you're suggesting, it seems, is that the onus is on the governments and people really who can make major decisions as opposed to individuals. Are you saying it should be out of the hands of the average person?
No, I'm simply saying we need to be realistic. What you can do, what you and I and the caller can do, is to say, well, I'd like to donate some money. People are buying carbon credits right now and saying, I feel good about myself because I live a carbon-free life. Well, maybe if you spend $10 buying a carbon credit but end up doing $2 worth of good in the world, I would ask, wouldn't that $10 have been spent better? And saying, I helped 10 people survive from malaria today? I would like to believe that I actually did the best I could, not just something that made me feel good.
Let me get a couple of emails that we got in here, Bjorn, as well. They're interesting. One was from René Polman in the Netherlands. It says, it's fairly easy to become popular through writing pro-pollution books. Whole branches of science have been based on that kind of loyalty. Someone denying that things are terribly wrong with the climate is endangering others. Your view?
Well, I mean, I understand, and I think honestly there have been people out there, people talking for big tobacco saying, oh, it's not dangerous. It's important to say that's not what I'm talking about. I'm simply saying we need to have the right facts. We need to point out that global warming is a problem. Thanks, Al Gore, for that. But we also need to be careful that we don't jump over to the other side and then say, oh my God, that's the only problem we need to focus on. We forget everything else, and that we may end up making very poor judgments.
So it's an issue of priorities, really, as far as
it really is a question of saying, what can we do and where should we invest our time and effort?
Let's get Anwar on the line from London. Anwar, what would you like to ask?
Assalamu alaikum, Rez.
Alaikum salam, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Rez, I'm surprised, that if we are going to introduce new technology to reduce the global warming, is it common sense that by introducing new technology, new ways, we will need energy and we'll be using more energy, we'll be actually creating more global warming?
Thanks,
so
Anwar.
I think
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually. The effort put in to try to fight it through getting new technologies may have a cost as well.
Well, obviously, the point here is to say if you invest in research and development on, for instance, wind and solar, they will become much cheaper. But the output of that, of course, is that we're actually going to use much more of it. As long as you have to rely on giving subsidies to these things, they're going to be politically divisive, and they're not really going to be mainstream. But honestly, if wind power was much cheaper than fossil fuels, both you and I and everyone else would buy them and have them. So the point is to make sure that they become so cheap that everybody will want to switch over. Right. There's another point in Anwar's question, which is to say that yes, when we help the third world, for instance, stop dying from HIV/AIDS and malaria, stop dying from malnutrition and so on, of course these people will get richer, and for a certain amount of time they will actually emit more CO2. Right. But I would also like to believe that it would be a world where they would actually stop dying, where their kids would get an education, where they'd start to flourish. And I think, honestly, that's a world that I would much rather like to partake.
We had an SMS question that came in and says, why do we link climate change exclusively to industrial CO2 emissions when planet Earth went through drastic climate changes long before industrialization?
Yeah, and that's one of the standard questions of saying, oh, maybe it's all natural. And it's totally true that the world has gone through many and much, much bigger changes than the ones that we're seeing right now. But of course, it didn't do so with us here. The point is that what matters to a civilization like ours is very much that it remains pretty much the same as what it was before. You and I and everybody else have built their houses just to the temperature and the way the climate was before. So if it changes, both if it gets colder or if it's more likely it gets warmer, that's going to be a problem. And that's the one that we're talking about.
Ironically, as you're answering, we just got a question through that came in from Algeria, and Tariq was saying, how do you explain that Earth went through major and drastic climate changes tens, even hundreds of centuries before the industrial CO2 emissions, which we've touched on there? Another email that came in actually from Manitoba in Canada here, Bjorn. Wayne Langlois says, we can anticipate catastrophic population changes and massive relocations, at some stage. How these population pressures are remedied remains to be seen. Absence of freshwater, desertification, and political consequences of these changes will precipitate a new world order. So his concern is more, it seems, on the population pressures that might take place.
And of course, the important point here is to remember, what is it that creates huge problems? Well, it's mostly poverty. If you're poor, then yes, you will be wandering far and away to change your life. But if you're rich, you very often change it where you are. Look at one of the most water scarce countries in the world, Israel. They actually do pretty well because they're rich. Whereas many countries that are poor and don't have enough water will do fairly badly. So the idea here is to say it's much, much better and more safe bet to ensure that these people get rich. That is, we fix the problems that we actually can fix and help them move towards a better life.
When you talk about huge countries such as China and India, which are large developing nations, which will have the huge price, well, will have a price to pay to some degree because of their development and industrialization and so on. Isn't there a benefit in trying to get in the latest technology now as they're going into this developmental phase to try to at least have some kind, I mean, surely a billion people, individually we may not make a difference, but a billion people does.
Absolutely. And China and India are the two major players here. Of course, the problem is right now we've talked about them having to cut their carbon emissions, and they're not likely to do so because they're, rightly, I think, saying, hell no, as long as 200 million of our inhabitants are still dirt poor. We want to address that problem. We want to make sure that they get enough to eat before we care about climate change. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't allow them to get the best and newest technology. We just still have to remember there's always a trade-off. When you talk about giving solar panels to very poor people so that they don't use fossil fuels, it makes us feel good and it looks good on TV. But of course it means that there are lots of other villages that didn't get the much cheaper solution of maybe just a kerosene burner. And so we have to remember all the time, it's a question of priorities, and it's a question of saying climate change is not the only problem. It's a problem, but not the only one.
Well, Fadi's in London with a question. Fadi, what would you like to ask? Go ahead, Fadi. You there? Yeah, go on.
Hi. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to talk here. I have a different question, and that is, when major polluters like USA and China, they are not doing enough to appreciate the problem and to reduce the carbon emission, and sometimes we can see, like Iraq war and Afghan war, they're just ignoring the world opinion. We, as world citizens, what power we have got?
Okay.
What can we do to oppose them and drag them to the to do something which is appropriate?
Okay, Fadi, let's get a response from Bjorn on that.
Well, it's a very good question that Fadi asks, because it's really about how do we get China and the US to do something about climate change. Well, the problem is that we've asked them to do something that would have a huge cost and do very little good. For the US, the cost would probably be $5 trillion, yet it would only, for the Kyoto Protocol, yet it would only postpone global warming some 5 years at the end of the century. Not a very good deal. For China, of course, the deal would be even worse, simply because they're much poorer. So it's about making sure that we make smart strategies, and that's why I'm suggesting instead of doing a new Kyoto where we just say cut more and more, we should invest in research and development. My proposal is to invest 0.05% of GDP in research and development on non-carbon emitting energy technologies. That will be much cheaper than Kyoto. There's much more likelihood that China and the US will say yes to this, and in the long term, it'll actually work a lot better than Kyoto.
Well, beyond a 30-second preview of your book, Cool It, let's see what you're going to, because obviously your last one, Skeptical Environmentalist, made a big wave, so what's Cool It going to be about?
Well, it's basically saying what we talked about, that climate change is real, it is man-made, it is definitely a problem, but the fact that we constantly hear exaggerated views means that we are unlikely to make good judgments. Right. So it's much more about smart solutions like the research and development I just talked about.
Well, Bjorn, I want to thank you very much. We'll hopefully speak to you again very soon on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. On the next show, we speak with Hugh Masekela, South African jazz legend, about the state of the industry there. Send in your questions to riz@aljazeera.net, and we'll see you next time. Street Talk's coming up next.